They say there are paths that don't appear on maps, underground trails that cross mountains, connect temples, and take the traveler not just to another place, but the other version of himself. And maybe, if you feel like certain things aren't coincidence, this video is exactly what your soul needed to hear today. Imagine walking in silence through the ruins of an ancient temple. The wind touches the stones as if leafing through a forgotten book, and then, almost without meaning to, you notice a crack in the floor, so discreet that it could go unnoticed by anyone, except for you. As he approaches, a slight chill runs across his skin, the deep sensation, intimate, inexplicable, that beneath that opening there is something alive, something waiting for someone who still remembers. For millennia, stories of hidden tunnels have been treated as legend, but when modern archaeologists have begun to find sealed passages beneath temples in Egypt, in South America, and in the heart of Asia, they realized that there were many coincidences too much to ignore. They were like veins of stone, connecting sacred places separated by continents and eras, as if ancient civilizations had left clues for anyone who had the courage to follow. And would you have? Because entering a tunnel is never just going down. It's going through a portal where the light changes, the sound changes, and even thoughts take on a different consistency. Maybe that's why so many cultures considered the underground a space of rebirth, the belly of the earth. Oh, first place where the soul learns to hear what the outside world tries to silence. Perhaps this is also why so many of these tunnels were sealed, not out of fear of that was inside, but for fear of what they could awaken in anyone who crossed them. And before we move on, take a deep breath. Let the body relax. We're about to go down together, not just in history, but in memory, because the real question is, it all starts with a detail that almost no one notices. A straight line where it should there is an irregularity. A displaced stone where everything seemed perfectly fitted. An echo that does not match the visible space. This is how many of the underground tunnels' most intriguing things in the world came to light, not with great discoveries but with small anomalies that insisted on not remaining silent. For the archaeologists who dared listening to them, these anomalies became doors. For us, they become paths of revelation. The first big revelation comes when scholars realize that these tunnels are not hurriedly made improvisations, but meticulously planned works. In many cases, the geometry repeats itself with an almost devotional precision. Tunnel after tunnel, you can see the same width, same slope, same use of natural acoustics. It's as if civilization separated by seas and millennia had received the same type of instruction, not just to excavate, but to carve out an inner experience. And when science and spirituality meet at this point, an inevitable question echoes. How do so many distant cultures arrive at the same architectural language of the invisible? Modern researchers attempt to explain these similarities through theories geographic, migratory routes, or functional coincidences. But when entering these tunnels, the sensation is different. The light behaves in a subtle and strange way, as if it were pulled into the walls. Sound doesn't just echo, it breathes. And with each step, familiar feeling, as if we were returning to a place we never remembered have visited. Perhaps this is why some cultures called these corridors underground paths of remembrance, because the impact is not just on the stone, but in the human essence that it awakens. And there is something even more unsettling. Many of these tunnels connect to temples that were once considered intense spiritual centers, places where people sought initiation, healing, or contact with the sacred. This changes everything. It wasn't about escape routes or buildings defensive as they so often tried to convince us. These tunnels were part of a greater ritual, a journey that began on the surface, passed through the belly of the earth, and emerged into the light again. It wasn't just architecture, it was spiritual psychology, one ancestral method for transforming someone without using a single word. But the real turning point comes when archaeologists begin to notice something disconcerting. Some of these passages do not lead to any rooms, chambers, or ritual rooms. No, they end in altars, inscriptions, or artifacts. They simply follow, silently, long distances, as if they were looking for something beyond the visible structure itself. It's as if these tunnels were more of a path than a destination, more process than objective, more question than answer. And then a bold hypothesis emerges. Perhaps these tunnels were designed to conduct consciousness, not just people. Perhaps they were spaces that functioned as internal mirrors, forcing the traveler to cross emotional layers, feelings, fears, and insights until reaching a kind of clarity that only the interior of the earth could reveal. In other words, perhaps they weren't tunnels to escape the world, but to find it inside. Science tries to explain this sensation through sensory deprivation, reduced acoustics, or the presence of specific minerals. Spirituality, on the other hand, speaks of portals, symbolic thresholds, and rebirths. Jung would call these tunnels archetypes, passages which represent the soul's journey towards its own center. Edgar Cayce would speak of corridors of memory, where fragments of old lives are reactivated. Ancient cultures would simply speak of return, what human beings have always sought even without understand. But perhaps the most fascinating part is this. The more archaeologists investigate, the more doors find. Sealed tunnels, corridors that seem guarded by layers of silence, passages that were closed not by collapse but by human intention. Why? What was inside? What should no longer be accessed? Or, what else weren't we ready to remember? And so, in front of silent stones and dark corridors, something awakens, an intuition almost childish, but profound. What if these tunnels are invitations? Invitations to cross what we have forgotten. Invitations to descend into the interior of the earth, and without realizing it, descend into the interior of us same. When we started comparing the tunnels found around the world, something surprising emerges. They are not just similar. They seem to dialogue with each other. Yes, as if civilizations that never met shared a memory silent. In temples in Egypt, the Andean mountains, the Mesoamerican deserts, and of Asian valleys, patterns repeat themselves as if they were fragments of a single lost language, a language engraved not on parchment but in stone, silence and darkness. In Egypt, for example, some of the oldest temples have underground passages so narrow and precise that they seem to have been designed for individual rituals, almost as paths of purification. In Saqqara, archaeologists found corridors that extend hundreds of meters beneath the necropolis, connecting ritual chambers separated by centuries of history. In Dendera, under the temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor, there is a network of tunnels that still intrigue scholars today. Some appear to have been used to store sacred objects. Others lead nowhere. Just they continue, as if they were paths whose destination is not geographic but spiritual. On the other side of the world, in the Andes, the mystery repeats itself. In Chavin de Huantar, one of the oldest cultures in America, tunnels form a labyrinth so complex that sound curve and the light is lost. There, priests would lead initiates through narrow passages where the wind imitated voices, and the water created echoes that seemed to come from within the rock itself. No, it was just architecture. It was spiritual psychology turned into ritual. Cross these corridors was to cross internal borders, and the feeling reported by many visitors, modern people, is always the same. As you emerge back to the surface, something inside you seems to have changed, as if an invisible veil had shifted. In Mesoamerica, the pattern becomes even more intriguing. Underneath the serpent pyramid emplumada, in Teotihuacan, archaeologists found a tunnel sealed for more than 1,800 years. Inside, hidden chambers contained not just artifacts, but symbols that they represented lower and higher worlds. The construction of the tunnel itself imitated a cosmic journey: descent, crossing, ascension. As in Egypt and the Andes, follow the underground was not to escape, but to be reborn. It was reconnecting with something that ancient civilizations believed it to have been forgotten. When we align these places, Egypt, Peru, Mexico, India, something changes within us. It is as if we were observing, not isolated works, but chapters of the same book underground, a book written by different hands but inspired by the same mystery, the human need to descend to understand. There are tunnels that connect temples distant within the same city. Others, according to ancient reports, would connect temples separated by kilometers, perhaps even entire regions. Egyptian legends speak of passages connecting temples of Isis to temples of Osiris. In the Americas, Quechua myths describe tunnels that ran through entire mountains, connecting sacred cities that today we see them only as isolated ruins. And then, an inevitable question arises. Why did so many cultures insist on connecting the sacred to the underground? Why do the most important temples guard doors that cannot be opened? Open towards the sky, but towards darkness. Perhaps because, for the ancients, the true light was not found above but below. The light that is born in silence. The light that forms when the mind is stripped of distractions. The light that only appears when we descend to the deep within ourselves. But there is an even more mysterious detail: the orientation of these tunnels. Some point out directly to the sunrise on specific days. Others, for constellations. Others even to sacred points in the Earth's own geology. There is no chance. There is intention. One intention, so profound that it crosses continents as if it were a collective memory. As if all these cultures were trying to remember something. Something that maybe we have completely forgotten. When observing these patterns, a strange sensation arises. What if these tunnels weren't just paths built by civilizations ancient, but paths that these civilizations heard, as if the earth had called, and they just responded? When we began to observe tunnels not as isolated structures, but as parts of a possible system, a new perception opens up, something almost unsettling. It's like look at a sky map and notice that seemingly unconnected stars form constellations when seen from afar. That's how the tunnels look too, fragments of a network that perhaps has always existed, but that we are only now beginning to see clearly. The first evidence of this possible global network comes when archaeologists note that many of these tunnels follow specific directions, aligned with underground rivers, faults, geological and energy points known to ancient cultures. The ancient people, they called these places lines of the dragon, veins of the earth, paths of the serpent, different names for the same phenomenon, flows that run underground, as if the planet had its own circulation. And the most impressive thing is that the tunnels accompany them, not as someone who tries to manipulate the earth, but as someone who listens to it. In Europe, recent discoveries revealed passages connecting caves kilometers away, some dating back more than 12,000 years. In Asia, Tibetan traditions speak of underground cities, connected by tunnels that run under entire mountains, forming corridors that served both as spiritual routes and as paths of protection in times of calamity. In the Middle East, ancient texts mention secret passages that linked temples and palaces, used not only as routes strategic, but as paths of initiation intended for priests. The similarity. It's not just structural, it's symbolic. And when we look at the Americas, the pattern intensifies. In Teotihuacan, for example, each tunnel discovered seems to be connected to a cosmological vision, representations of the underworld, chambers that symbolized rebirth, corridors that led to rooms aligned with specific stars. In Peru, underground passages connect sites, ceremonial structures that, seen from above, form designs similar to snakes. In Bolivia, under Tiahuanaco, local stories tell of tunnels that extended to Lake Titicaca, no as a metaphor, but as a fact accepted by generations. These reports are repeated in cultures that have never had contact with each other. And this leads us to a bold hypothesis. Perhaps these civilizations weren't just imitating each others. Perhaps they were responding to the same internal or external impulse. Maybe we're digging because they noticed something underground that we, with all our technology, we still don't fully understand. Modern science, in turn, begins to observe a revealing detail. Ancient tunnels tend to align with points where the Earth's magnetic field presents variations. Significant. Some of these places are considered anomalous zones, where compasses behave erratically and animals avoid passing. Interestingly, they are the same points that many cultures venerated as sacred. This raises a profound question. Did ancient people have a natural sensitivity to magnetism? Did these tunnels were not just physical routes, but instruments for interacting with these underground energies? And then, the spiritual layer appears. In many traditions, the underground is not seen as a place of darkness, but of origin. The world below is described as the space where the spirit is shaped, where ancestral memories rest, where the earth breathes. When civilizations build tunnels, they don't just excavate rocks, they recreate the journey of birth, descend, cross, emerge. That's why so many of these runners are narrow at the beginning and wide at the end. This is why the light always returns. That's why so many rituals involved going underground to find oneself again. But there is an even more disturbing detail. In several regions of the world, tunnels have been sealed with perfectly fitted stones, as if a common consciousness had decided that certain passages needed to be closed, not destroyed, preserved and hidden, as if waiting for another time or another type of traveler. By connecting all these dots, structures, legends, geological patterns, and symbolism, a silent but powerful revelation emerges. Perhaps we have never walked on a divided world, but on a world connected from below. A network so ancient, so deep, and so mysterious that its mere existence defies everything what we think we know about our origins. And so, inevitably, the question returns with more force. What exactly were these civilizations trying to achieve by excavating paths that not only touch the earth, but also consciousness? When we enter the tunnels associated with ancient temples, we notice something immediately. They were not made for the body. They were made for the eye, spirit. Architecture makes this clear. The proportion of the walls, the curvature of the passages, the way in which light is lost or multiplied, everything seems to plan not only the physical movement, but the internal state of the traveler. It's like every tunnel is a prayer carved in stone, a silent liturgy, an ancient phrase that is only understood when crossed with the entire body. In many temples, archaeologists have discovered corridors so narrow that they force the visitor to advance, bent over as if re-entering the womb of the earth. Others were wide enough for the sound to echo like a chant, transforming the breathing in music. And there are passages where the light barely enters, creating such a pitch-black deep that time seems to disappear. This combination of darkness, sound, and silence, it was not casual. It was ritual. It was emotional science. It was applied spiritual psychology with a precision that still impresses researchers today. The structure of these tunnels reveals something fascinating. Many have transition points, areas where the ceiling becomes lower or the air becomes colder, as if marking stages of an inner journey. In Chavinda, for example, the traveler was led by corridors that distorted perception, making each step seem like a crossing between worlds. There, priests used ceremonial instruments to produce sounds that turned into roars, not to scare, but to induce a state-altered consciousness. The tunnel was not just a passage, it was transformation. In Egypt, some temples have chambers where the acoustics create a unique effect. A simple whispered word reverberates as if the space responds. Archaeologists initially believed this was chance, but later analysis showed that the geometry was intentionally constructed to amplify specific frequencies. Result? An environment capable of inducing deep introspection, as if every sound forced the traveler to listen to his own soul. And here we come to an essential point. These tunnels were not made for crowds but for individuals. And this reveals that the underground journey was intimate, personal, deeply human. Was a process in which the person descended to find what the surface hid. Modern science tries to explain this using concepts such as sensory deprivation, altered respiratory patterns, and acoustic stimuli. And yes, these explanations make sense, but there is something that escapes any formula: the spiritual sensation. What the body feels before the mind interprets. What makes the heart race even without danger real? That which makes someone cry without knowing exactly why. The ancients knew how to use the earth as a mirror, and in these tunnels, they transformed emotion into revelation. It is at this point that the most important element of these rituals appears: the final passage. In many cultures, the tunnel ended in a larger space, lit by a crack, an opening, or even a carefully positioned flame. The objective was clear. After the descending into the interior, the traveler should emerge into the light, not just physical but symbolic. It was a rebirth, a ritual death followed by an awakening, and this was repeated in Egypt to Peru, from Mesoamerica to Asia. The underground journey was not just spiritual practice, it was a map of the soul. And here I make a sincere invitation. If something inside you is awakening as you listen to this story, remain until the end. The answer you are looking for may be precisely along this path. Interestingly, many of these tunnels have markings on the walls, not inscriptions or symbols, but marks of touch, friction, hands passing, evidence that travelers they were looking for security, direction, or maybe connection. It's as if those who descend knew they were entering a space where fear and the sacred collide. They found, and when touching the stone, they tried to remember that they were still human. Atera responded with silence, but a silence that heals. And here comes the turning point. Some tunnels, especially those linked to initiation temples, were sealed, not because they were dangerous, but because their purpose was not eternal. It was cyclical. It was for a specific time, for a specific type of consciousness, maybe for a humanity that today tries to relearn how to listen to what the ancient world whispered with so much clarity. And so, there remains a question that vibrates like a sustained note in the darkness. What did these temples want us to awaken before returning to the light? On almost every continent, there is a pattern that repeats itself with disturbing precision. Underground tunnels linked to temples, sacred cities, or ceremonial sites were purposely sealed. They did not collapse. They were not taken over by erosion. They did not collapse with the time. They were closed, deliberately. Layers of stones perfectly fitted together, as if whoever put them in knew exactly what they were doing, and what that was preventing it from being found. And it's right here at this silent point of history, which begins the discomfort of modern archaeology. In Egypt, for example, several corridors discovered beneath important temples have entrances blocked by huge slabs, so well positioned that they seem to protect something sensitive. Some of these blockages have been detected by sonar and laser, but cannot be excavated due to structural risks. Others were simply declared areas restricted, and when asked why these restrictions were imposed, archaeologists and administrators often respond with vague phrases tied to security protocols, preservation. But this excessive caution raises more questions than it answers, especially when much more fragile structures are excavated without as much resistance. In Mesoamerica, the scenario is similar. In Teotihuacan, after the tunnel was discovered under the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, several adjacent areas were quickly closed to the public. Soon after the discovery of chambers with liquid mercury, something absolutely unusual for the time, exploration teams were reduced, access were limited, and part of the gallery was sealed again, officially, for protection and future studies. But some independent archaeologists claim that the sudden closure occurred after sensors detected even deeper spaces, whose extension has not yet been revealed. And then the pattern emerges. The deeper the tunnel, the more restricted the investigation. In the Andes Mountains, underground passages between temples have been found and immediately banned. In some cases, the justification is the risk of collapse. In others, cultural protection. But local residents tell another story. They say authorities fear what's inside. And the most intriguing thing is that these populations, which carry centuries-old oral tradition, speak of tunnels that should not be opened before the right time. A phrase that echoes like a prophecy or like a memory. Science tries to follow its path, but finds doors closed. And this causes an inevitable tension. What exactly cannot be shown? Is it just the fear of speculative theories gaining traction? Or is there something more deep being protected, and not just physically? When we analyze official documents, we realize that many of these places have incomplete reports. Vague notes about sensitive material, delicate structures, or undefined objects appear repeatedly. And at the same time, there are team records who were denied access at the last moment, even after years of preparation technique. What leads the independent scientific community to suspect that this is not just to preserve heritage, but to preserve narratives. There is also the geopolitical factor. Many of these tunnels are located in regions where power disputes, exploration rights, and economic interests intermingle. It means that controlling the underground is, in a way, controlling history. And control the story is to control the collective imagination. After all, if profound discoveries revealed that ancient societies had a much greater spiritual and technological understanding advanced than what we teach today, many power structures would need to be rewritten, including academics. But there is something even more subtle about this story. In several reports, teachers, archaeologists, and even local guides claim to have seen runners who subsequently disappeared, no by magic, but because they were sealed between one visit and the next. The feeling that remains is that there is a curation of what may or may not come to light, as if we were being led to see only part of the truth, as if the tunnels were one book, but the most important pages were glued together. And then, spiritual reflection arises. Perhaps these tunnels were sealed because they contained rituals that required inner, not just technical maturity. Maybe they would keep initiatory practices that could be misinterpreted in a world as fast-paced as the ours. Or perhaps they were literally portals, not in the fanciful sense but in the psychological. Structures capable of taking human beings to states of consciousness that are still, we don't know how to understand. And in the face of so many ceilings, restrictions, fears, and silences, one question remains open like a half-open door in the dark. What do these tunnels hide, or reveal, that we haven't yet considered? Pro-NTs to see. When we look at all these tunnels, their patterns, their geometry, their silences, something begins to emerge slowly, like a photograph developed in water. Perhaps these paths were not only built within the earth, but within the human consciousness itself. And, when we analyze this phenomenon in the light of spirituality, of deep psychology and what ancient cultures called memory of the earth, a powerful hypothesis emerges. A hypothesis that does not compete with science, but enlarge. First, we need to consider the idea that the earth also holds memories. No just fossils and minerals, but energy records. Many ancient people believed that certain regions of the planet functioned as points of memory, places where events spirituals accumulated like persistent echoes. These places, according to their traditions, were marked by the presence of tunnels or caves that served as portals to access these invisible layers. Today, we call this magnetism, resonance, Schumann, electromagnetic fields. They called it the spirit of the earth. Perhaps it is no coincidence that many tunnels line up with geological faults, sources underground, or mineral concentrations. These elements produce energy fields that the human body, even without realizing it, records. Sensations of goosebumps, of presence, of internal expansion. Jung would call this contact with the collective unconscious. Tesla, I would talk about resonance. The ancients simply called it awakening. And here the first layer of the spiritual hypothesis appears. These tunnels were designed to put humans in contact with higher levels depths of the mind itself and the earth itself, not to escape but to access, not to hide, but to remember. Now, the second layer, the possibility that these corridors functioned as amplifiers of states of consciousness. The combination of dense darkness, silence almost absolute, and mineral vibration creates an environment where attention turns not outwards but inside. This type of forced introspection has always been used in rituals of initiation, and perhaps the tunnels were the ultimate spiritual engineering, a controlled to induce visions, understandings, and perceptions that the surface never would allow. Archaeologists describe tunnels that change temperature, corridors that seem amplify heartbeats, chambers where acoustics create the sensation of presence. For science, they are physical phenomena. For ancient people, they were portals, not portals to another world, but to another layer of the same world. And that layer was internal. And then we come to the third layer of this hypothesis, that these tunnels represented a symbolic journey of the soul. Each civilization, in its own way, describes the spiritual process as a descent followed by of ascension. The Egyptians called it duat. The Greeks, from Hades, not as punishment, but as a crossing. Andean shamans speak of ukupacha, the inner world. All describe the same archetype, descending to awaken. What if ancient civilizations transformed this archetype into architecture? What if every tunnel was a living metaphor? A path for the initiate to physically experience their own rebirth? The fourth layer arises from traditions that speak of portals of consciousness, spaces where the veil between the visible and the invisible becomes thinner. Not space portals, but portals psychological and spiritual, places where the mind perceives more, feels more, remembers more. Many of these portals, interestingly, are located exactly where we find old tunnels. This raises a profound question. Ancient civilizations dug tunnels because those places were special, or did these places become special because they were excavated? Maybe both things are true. And finally, we reach the deepest layer of the hypothesis, that these tunnels were created to awaken something that is not just individual, but collective, an old memory that lives beneath the surface of the earth. and beneath the surface of human consciousness. A memory that speaks of who we were, what we already knew, and what, perhaps, we have forgotten. When walking through these tunnels, the traveler is not only met with silence, meets the origin, with what existed before religions, borders, written stories, with what still pulsates discreetly, deep within the human soul. And it's because that's why so many tunnels were sealed. Perhaps their purpose was not eternal. Maybe they were tools to help a humanity that lived more inward than outward, a humanity that remembered. And so, the final question of this block echoes, deep as a living rock. Are we heading back to the time when these tunnels within the earth and within us, will they begin to open? There is a moment, at the end of every underground journey, when silence stops frightening. He becomes a kind of companion, not the void that is Euphocca, but the space where something can finally breathe. Perhaps this is the true gift of tunnels, the discovery that in the dark, we are not alone. We are accompanied by us, same, and, in some mysterious way, accompanied by the memory of the earth. When we emerge from the darkness into the light, we realize that nothing we saw there underneath it was just ancient history. Every tunnel, every damp wall, every corridor that it seemed to make no sense. In fact, it reflected something within us. The ancients knew that the soul learns through experience, not just through words. And maybe that's why they built such deep paths, because they knew that the surface is important, but they never enough. When we contemplate these tunnels as a global network, physical, symbolic, and spiritual, we begin to suspect something bigger, not a secret kept by lost civilizations, but a secret kept by ourselves. The memory that, before we were surface dwellers, we were interior walkers, beings accustomed to facing the silence, listening to what has no form, perceiving life beneath the noise. And when we look at today's world, so full of speed and distraction, these tunnels seem to make even more sense. It's as if they called us back, not so that discover hidden cities or forgotten artifacts, but in order for us to discover a depth that everyday life tries to steal from us. The depth of feeling, to remember, to perceive your own soul without fear. Archaeologists continue to investigate. Some tunnels remain sealed, others prohibited, others just forgotten. But in the meantime, we keep going down, no physically, but internally, because in a way, each person carries within themselves an ancient labyrinth, a path that only she can follow, a corridor that only lights up when it is crossed. And that's why certain stories touch us so deeply. They light up doors that we thought were locked. Maybe that's why you've come this far. Maybe some part of you was searching precisely this silent descent. Not to find ready-made answers, but to find questions that make the soul move. Questions that bring us closer to who we really are, and not just who we learn to be. And if this journey has awakened something in you, no matter how small the spark, allow yourself to keep walking. Not in the underground of the world, but in the underground of the heart. There are tunnels that no one can dig for you. There are lights that only shine when you accept, go through the dark itself. And there are memories that only awaken when we stop running. If this message has found its place within you, I invite you to follow along with us. If this trip touched something profound, sign up and stay on this journey. Your soul is perhaps remembering the path. And now I leave you with one last thought, simple but vast. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a tunnel that the soul always did you know how to navigate?